On December 8, 1941, a young Japanese naval officer found himself in a situation his entire military training had assured him would never happen. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki was alive, captured, and in American hands on Sand Island in Honolulu. Just one day before, he'd been piloting a midget submarine during the Pearl Harbor assault, mentally prepared for death in service of the Emperor. Instead, after his vessel ran aground on a reef, he'd washed up on Waimanalo Beach and into the custody of American forces. Everything he thought he knew about warfare, honor, and his enemies was about to be systematically dismantled. The process began with something as mundane as a meal. American guards delivered food to Sakamaki during those first hours of captivity. Though we lack precise documentation of what appeared on that tray, military records confirm that American forces operated under Geneva Convention protocols requiring POWs to eat the same rations as US soldiers. What Sakamaki anticipated was torture and deliberate starvation. What he received instead likely surpassed anything he'd consumed during months of Japanese naval service. The quantity alone would have startled him, but the quality proved even more disorienting. This pattern of expectation shattered by reality would repeat itself across roughly 5,000 Japanese soldiers captured throughout the Pacific Theater from 1942 through 1945. That figure seems almost negligible next to the 378,000 German prisoners held by American forces, yet the statistical comparison misses the profound significance of each individual case. Every single Japanese POW had violated the most sacred principle hammered into them through military indoctrination, that death represented the only acceptable alternative to capture. Having crossed that threshold and survived, these men would encounter treatment from their American captors that contradicted every certainty their training had instilled. The food they ate and the conditions they experienced would systematically dismantle their understanding of their enemies, their nation, and the fundamental nature of warfare. The capture itself delivered the first shock to the system. Japanese military doctrine, codified in the Field Service Code distributed throughout the armed forces in January 1941, contained explicit instructions. Do not live in shame as a prisoner, die, and leave no ignominious crime behind you. Training emphasized repeatedly that Americans would subject any prisoner to torture, mutilation, and eventual execution, making suicide the sole path that preserved honor when capture became unavoidable. Reality proved startlingly different from these assurances. Documentation from Marine and Army units operating across Pacific theaters shows consistent protocols. Japanese soldiers taken into custody received immediate medical treatment, water, and food from American combat rations. This wasn't theater performed for propaganda purposes, but genuine military procedure, motivated partly by intelligence-gathering needs and partly by American commitment to international warfare conventions. The contradiction between predicted torture and actual care began working immediately on prisoner psychology. Transportation to permanent facilities delivered another wave of cognitive dissonance. Japanese forces had transported Allied prisoners in what became known as hell ships, cargo vessels where hundreds died in airless holds without adequate food or water. Japanese prisoners making the Pacific crossing to America traveled differently. They received bunks, blankets, and regular meals during the voyage. While detailed personal accounts from most Japanese POWs during these journeys remain scarce, American military documentation confirms prisoners received standard Navy rations throughout transport. 3 daily meals featuring beans, bread, canned meat, vegetables, and coffee. Arrival on American soil administered perhaps the most devastating psychological blow of all. Ships carrying Japanese POWs typically docked at Angel Island in San Francisco Bay for initial processing before prisoners were distributed to permanent facilities. Sakamaki arrived there on March 1, 1942, alongside 172 Japanese Americans arrested following Pearl Harbor. From Angel Island, the distribution system sent Japanese prisoners to various camps, with the largest concentration eventually residing at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Camp McCoy evolved into the most significant Japanese POW installation in the continental United States, ultimately holding 2,700 Japanese prisoners at peak capacity. The facility had been hastily adapted from a civilian conservation corps site and expanded to accommodate POWs from multiple Axis nations. By war's end, McCoy housed approximately 3,000 Germans, 2,700 Japanese, and 500 Koreans who'd been conscripted into Japanese military service. What Japanese soldiers encountered at Camp McCoy systematically demolished every assumption they'd held about prisoner treatment. The barracks, though basic by American civilian standards, featured amenities exceeding what most had known in their own military service. Steam heating kept buildings warm through Wisconsin winters. Electric lights burned reliably. Hot water flowed from taps. Flush toilets functioned properly. The lumber used to construct each building exceeded the total wood available in entire Japanese villages during wartime. The camp hospital contained X-ray equipment, surgical instruments, and medications that had become unavailable even in Japanese military medical facilities by 1942. Yet the mess halls delivered the most profound psychological impact. Camp records and the limited available testimonies indicate Japanese POWs at McCoy received 3 hot meals daily that met Geneva Convention standards. The daily ration included items that had vanished from Japan years earlier: genuine coffee instead of burnt barley substitutes, white bread, butter, sugar without rationing cards, fresh milk, eggs and meat served at nearly every meal. Camp authorities, recognizing cultural considerations, made special accommodations for Japanese prisoners. Historical documentation confirms that Japanese POWs received steamed rice at least once daily and had access to soy sauce with meals. Chopsticks replaced standard utensils. When possible, the camp obtained ingredients for more traditionally Japanese-style preparations, though these were prepared with American abundance rather than wartime Japanese scarcity. The sheer quantity and quality of food proved devastating to Japanese military ideology. While precise menu documentation remains limited, camp regulations mandated each prisoner receive approximately 3,500 calories daily. This exceeded what Japanese civilians were getting by 1943, when home island rations had dropped to roughly 1,500 calories per day. The psychological disruption of eating better as enemy prisoners than they had as imperial soldiers created cognitive dissonance that began fracturing the foundation of their indoctrination. Among the few documented Japanese prisoner accounts comes one from Second Lieutenant Minoru Wada, captured on Guam and eventually transferred to Camp McCoy. In a post-war interview conducted during the 1980s, Wada recalled his astonishment at the sheer waste he witnessed. Americans discarded food that Japanese soldiers would have treasured: partially eaten bread, surplus milk, vegetables with minor blemishes. This waste seemed incomprehensible to minds shaped by scarcity, yet it demonstrated American abundance more powerfully than any propaganda could have achieved. The Christmas celebration of 1944 at Camp McCoy provided particularly powerful psychological impact. Camp records show all POWs, including the Japanese, received a special holiday meal featuring turkey, ham, stuffing, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, and gravy potatoes, gravy, vegetables, and multiple desserts. Local churches and civic organizations, despite having family members fighting Japan in the Pacific, sent cookies, cakes, and care packages to the camp for distribution to all prisoners, including Japanese ones. This kindness extended toward enemies proved more devastating to Japanese military ideology than any battlefield defeat. While the concept of benevolence toward adversaries existed in Japanese philosophy through Bushido principles, the practical application by Americans toward Japanese prisoners who'd been attempting to kill them months earlier created profound psychological disruption. Guards sharing their cigarettes, cooks ensuring prisoners received full portions, medical staff treating Japanese wounded with identical care given to American soldiers, all demonstrated a form of strength through humanity that Japanese militarism had never acknowledged existed. The labor program at Camp McCoy added another dimension to the transformation process. Japanese prisoners initially resisted work details, believing any labor aided the enemy war effort. Practical considerations and camp monotony eventually led to participation. Those assigned to Wisconsin dairy farms encountered agricultural abundance defying comprehension. A single American farm might possess more dairy cows than entire Japanese prefectures. Electric milking machines, refrigerated storage, mechanized feed systems, technologies that hadn't existed in most of Japan even before the war. The farmers themselves became unwitting agents of psychological transformation. Despite language barriers and the reality that many had sons fighting in the Pacific, Wisconsin farmers often treated Japanese POW laborers with practical kindness. Historical records document instances of farmers sharing lunch with POW work crews, teaching them American farming methods, and sometimes sending extra food back to camps. This human-level interaction, free from military propaganda on either side, allowed Japanese prisoners to perceive Americans as individuals rather than the demons of their indoctrination. Medical treatment provided at Camp McCoy deserves particular attention. The camp hospital treated Japanese POWs for everything from routine ailments to major surgeries. Conditions that would have meant death or permanent disability in Japanese military service were routinely treated and cured. Dental care, virtually non-existent in the Japanese military by 1943, was readily available. Prisoners received eyeglasses, hearing aids, and prosthetics as needed. Mental health treatment, though primitive by modern standards, still far exceeded anything available in the Japanese military, where psychological problems were viewed as weakness, deserving punishment rather than treatment. Educational opportunities provided to prisoners added another transformative layer. While participation remained voluntary, Camp McCoy offered English classes, American history lessons, and vocational training. Some Japanese prisoners, initially suspicious of indoctrination attempts, discovered these programs were practical rather than propagandistic. Learning English, understanding American agricultural and industrial methods, and gaining vocational skills became ways to prepare for an uncertain post-war future. The camp library, stocked with American magazines and newspapers censored only for military information, provided windows into American society that contradicted every aspect of Japanese propaganda. Photographs in Life magazine showed American cities untouched by war, factories producing consumer goods alongside military equipment, civilians living with comfort unknown in wartime Japan. Advertisements for automobiles, refrigerators, and television sets, still experimental but advertised, revealed a society of unimaginable wealth and technological advancement. Perhaps the most profound impact emerged from simple daily routines of camp life. Japanese prisoners observed American efficiency and abundance in countless small ways. Electric lights burned continuously, never subject to blackouts or shortages. Hot water flowed at any time, never rationed or restricted. Toilet paper, soap, and other hygiene products appeared in unlimited supply. Laundry services cleaned and pressed prisoner clothing to standards exceeding what Japanese officers enjoyed. Each small comfort and convenience added another crack to the ideological foundation of Japanese militarism. The relationship between Japanese and German POWs at Camp McCoy provided unexpected lessons. Germans, who'd initially looked down on Japanese as racial inferiors despite their nominal alliance, gradually came to respect their discipline and work ethic. Some Germans, particularly those who'd served on the Eastern Front and witnessed German defeats firsthand, discussed the reality of American industrial might they'd encountered. These conversations, conducted in broken English or through interpreters, helped Japanese prisoners understand that their defeat wasn't unique to Japan, but part of challenging American industrial capacity that no nation could match. Italian prisoners at Camp McCoy, reclassified as co-belligerents after Italy switched sides in 1943, received even more favorable treatment. They could work freely in local communities, eat in restaurants, and some even attended local dances. Japanese prisoners observed former enemies being transformed into near allies through American pragmatism. This flexibility and lack of permanent hatred contradicted the rigid Japanese military worldview where enemies remained enemies forever. By early 1945, news of American advances across the Pacific reached Camp McCoy through newspapers and radio broadcasts that prisoners could access. Japanese POWs watched their homeland being systematically destroyed while they lived in relative comfort and safety. The psychological burden of surviving while comrades died, eating full meals while Japanese civilians starved, sleeping in warm beds while cities burned, created complex emotional responses that many would carry for the rest of their lives. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 created a unique crisis for Japanese POWs. Horror at the destruction mixed with relief that invasion had been avoided, but most profoundly, the atomic bombs confirmed American technological superiority in the most dramatic way possible. For prisoners who'd witnessed American abundance in small daily ways, the atomic bomb simply represented the ultimate expression of industrial and scientific capability they'd observed in everything from electric lights to canned peaches. The Emperor's surrender broadcast on August 15, 1945, created different challenges for Japanese POWs than for Germans. While German prisoners generally felt eager to return home, many Japanese POWs feared repatriation. In Japanese society, they were officially dead, their families having received notification of their deaths in battle. Returning alive meant bringing shame not just to themselves, but to their entire families. Some prisoners at Camp McCoy reportedly requested to remain in America rather than face the disgrace of returning to Japan as survivors. American authorities began preparing Japanese POWs for repatriation with unexpected sensitivity. Camp officials arranged for Buddhist priests to provide counseling. Officers who'd served in the Pacific came to speak with prisoners, not about the war, but about rebuilding Japan. The message remained consistent. Japan needed educated, skilled workers to rebuild. The knowledge prisoners had gained in America, agricultural techniques, industrial methods, English language skills, would prove valuable in reconstruction. The repatriation process itself became a final lesson in American organizational capacity. Each prisoner received new clothing, shoes, personal hygiene items, and travel rations for the journey home. The efficiency of processing thousands of prisoners, arranging transportation, coordinating with occupation authorities in Japan, and managing complex logistics demonstrated American administrative capability matching their industrial might. The voyage back to Japan on American ships provided one last exposure to American abundance. Unlike hellish conditions on Japanese transport ships, repatriated POWs travelled in actual passenger quarters with regular meals, medical care, and basic comforts. The contrast with how Japan had transported Allied prisoners couldn't have been starker. Even in victory, America treated defeated enemies better than Japan had treated its own soldiers. For Kazuo Sakamaki, the return to Japan came after 4 years in American captivity, having lived better as a prisoner than he had as an officer in the Imperial Navy. His memoir, published in Japan as I Attacked Pearl Harbor, became one of the few first-hand accounts of Japanese POW experience, though cultural shame limited its initial impact. Sakamaki's post-war life embodied the transformation American captivity had wrought. He joined Toyota Motor Corporation, using English skills gained in prison camps to help develop export markets. He eventually became president of Toyota's Brazilian subsidiary, building international business relationships that would have been impossible without his prisoner experience. When asked about his wartime experience in later years, Sakamaki emphasized not the shame of capture, but the lessons learned about different ways of living and thinking. The broader impact of Japanese POW experiences on post-war Japan remains difficult to quantify precisely because so few prisoners spoke publicly about their captivity. The shame associated with survival as prisoners meant most never discussed their experiences even with family members. Yet their influence can be traced in subtle ways through post-war Japanese society. Many former POWs found employment with American occupation forces as interpreters and liaisons, using English skills learned in camps. Others applied agricultural and industrial knowledge gained from prison labor to help rebuild Japan's devastated economy. Some became advocates for international cooperation and exchange, having experienced firsthand that former enemies could coexist peacefully. While they rarely spoke of their prisoner experiences directly, their actions reflected lessons learned in American camps. The contrast between American treatment of Japanese POWs and Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners became a powerful, if largely unspoken, influence on post-war Japanese attitudes. While exact statistics vary, approximately 40% of American POWs died in Japanese captivity, compared to less than 1% of Japanese POWs who died in American camps. This disparity, when it became known, contributed to Japanese reflection on wartime conduct and post-war commitment to international humanitarian standards. The food served in American POW camps, from that first meal given to Kazuo Sakamaki to the last dinner served before repatriation, accomplished something military defeat alone could never achieve. It demonstrated through the most basic human experience, eating, that the entire foundation of Japanese militarism was built on lies. America wasn't weak, but incomprehensibly strong. Americans weren't barbarians, but capable of treating enemies with dignity. Democracy didn't create chaos, but abundance. These lessons, learned 3 times daily in mess halls across America, transformed warriors into citizens who would help build a peaceful, prosperous post-war Japan. The psychological impact extended beyond material abundance to fundamental questions about society and values. Japanese prisoners had been taught that democracy created weakness, that racial mixing destroyed strength, that individualism led to chaos. Yet they witnessed a diverse America functioning with efficiency exceeding anything in homogeneous, authoritarian Japan. They saw African American soldiers serving alongside whites, women working in factories, immigrants from dozens of nations contributing to the war effort. This diversity, which Japanese propaganda had portrayed as America's fatal weakness, appeared instead to be a source of strength. The camp experience also exposed Japanese prisoners to American concepts of law and rights with no equivalent in Imperial Japan. Prisoners could file complaints about treatment, and these complaints were actually investigated. The Geneva Convention, which Japan had signed but never ratified, was scrupulously followed by American authorities even when prisoners themselves didn't understand their rights. Guards who mistreated prisoners faced punishment. This rule of law, applying even to enemies, demonstrated a form of strength through self-restraint that contradicted everything about might-makes-right militarism. Religious freedom in camps provided another revelation. Buddhist prisoners could practice their faith despite America being predominantly Christian and at war with a Buddhist nation. Christian missionaries visited camps, but participation in religious services remained voluntary, never forced. Some prisoners encountered Christianity for the first time, not as Western imperialism, but as personal faith practiced by guards and volunteers who showed genuine kindness. This religious tolerance contradicted Japanese propaganda about American cultural imperialism. Interaction with American civilians, limited but significant, left lasting impressions. Wisconsin farmers who employed POW labor, church groups that sent Christmas packages, medical staff who treated prisoners, all demonstrated that American society functioned on principles different from what Japanese militarism had taught. Kindness wasn't weakness, but confidence. Generosity wasn't foolishness, but abundance. Mercy wasn't cowardice, but strength. Even the waste that shocked Japanese prisoners carried profound lessons. Americans could afford to throw away food because they produced so much. They could discard partially used items because replacement came easy. They could be careless with resources because resources were effectively unlimited. This waste wasn't moral failing, but mathematical proof of industrial capacity that Japan could never match. Every discarded crust of bread, every half-empty milk bottle, every uneaten portion testified to American abundance that made victory inevitable. The camp routine itself, regular meals, scheduled activities, educational opportunities, recreational time, demonstrated American organizational capability. Managing thousands of enemy prisoners while fighting a global war, yet maintaining humane standards and efficient operations, showed administrative competence matching industrial might. The camps ran smoothly, not through brutal discipline, but through systematic organization and adequate resources. Japanese prisoners observed American technology in countless daily applications. Electric lighting never failed, heating systems maintained comfortable temperatures, plumbing worked reliably, kitchen equipment prepared meals for thousands efficiently. Each mechanical system, functioning smoothly day after day, demonstrated American engineering superiority. The technology wasn't just advanced, but reliable, maintained, and taken for granted in ways that would have seemed miraculous in Japan. Medical care provided to prisoners went beyond treatment to include preventive medicine. Regular health inspections, vaccinations, dental checkups, vision tests, all provided to enemy prisoners while Japanese civilians lacked basic medical care. Camp hospitals used penicillin freely while Japanese soldiers died from infections treatable with basic antibiotics. This medical abundance demonstrated American scientific advancement and industrial capacity to mass-produce medicines that remained laboratory curiosities in Japan. Educational materials available to prisoners opened windows into American thought and culture. While military information was censored, prisoners could read American literature, study American history, learn about American government and economics. These materials, intended simply to provide occupation and education, inadvertently demonstrated American confidence. Only a nation certain of its values could allow enemies to study its system so openly. The transition from military indoctrination to prisoner life created identity crises for many Japanese POWs. They'd been taught that their worth came from serving the emperor, that individual life had meaning only through sacrifice for the nation. In American camps, they discovered individual dignity, personal choice, and human value separate from military service. This philosophical transformation, though rarely articulated, fundamentally changed how former prisoners viewed themselves and society. Some Japanese prisoners developed friendships with guards that transcended the captor-prisoner relationship. While language barriers limited deep communication, shared humanity emerged through simple interactions, learning each other's names, sharing photographs of families, teaching words in each other's languages. These human connections, impossible under Japanese military discipline, demonstrated that enemies were artificial constructs that could be dissolved through personal contact. Observation of American military efficiency without brutality provided important lessons. American guards maintained discipline through rules and procedures, not violence and fear. Officers led through competence rather than arbitrary authority. The military hierarchy functioned through respect rather than terror. This alternative model of military organization, more effective than Japanese authoritarianism, influenced former POWs who later served in Japan's post-war self-defense forces. As the war progressed and more Japanese prisoners arrived at camps, earlier prisoners became informal educators, preparing newcomers for the psychological shock of American abundance. They explained that the food wasn't propaganda, that medical treatment was genuine, that the kindness, while incomprehensible, was real. This peer education helped new prisoners adjust more quickly, but also deepened the collective understanding that everything they'd believed about America was wrong. Camp newspapers and newsletters, produced by prisoners themselves within guidelines, became vehicles for processing the transformation. While few copies survive, and most were in Japanese, making them inaccessible to American camp administrators, these noted that content evolved from initial defiance to gradual acceptance to eventually discussing post-war reconstruction. This editorial evolution traced the psychological journey from military indoctrination to acceptance of defeat to preparation for a different future. Sports and recreational activities in camps provided unexpected lessons about American values. Prisoners could play baseball, volleyball, and other sports. Competition was encouraged, but winning wasn't everything. Sportsmanship, fair play, and enjoyment mattered as much as victory. This approach to competition, so different from the life-or-death intensity of Japanese military culture, demonstrated that strength could coexist with leisure, that warriors could also be athletes, that enemies could compete without hatred. Camp libraries became particularly important for the minority of Japanese prisoners who could read English or were learning it. American magazines from before the war showed a society of extraordinary prosperity. Advertisements for luxury cars, suburban homes, household appliances, vacation resorts. These glimpses of pre-war American life demonstrated that the abundance prisoners witnessed wasn't a wartime anomaly, but normal American existence temporarily redirected toward military production. Observation of American women working in various camp support roles challenged Japanese concepts of gender and society. Female nurses, administrators, and volunteers demonstrated competence and authority while maintaining femininity. They drove vehicles, managed offices, and made decisions independently. This female participation in public life, which Japanese militarism had portrayed as Western decadence, appeared instead as utilization of the entire population's capabilities. Even Wisconsin weather provided its own lessons. The harsh winters required extensive resources to maintain comfortable conditions: fuel for heating, warm clothing, additional food calories. American camps maintained these standards without complaint or shortage. Japanese prisoners from warmer regions experienced snow for the first time while living more comfortably than they ever had in Japan. The ability to maintain comfort despite environmental challenges demonstrated mastery over nature through technology and resources. Camp infrastructure, sewage systems, water treatment, electrical generation, road maintenance, functioned reliably day after day, maintained by American personnel who treated routine maintenance as normal rather than exceptional. This invisible but essential infrastructure, taken for granted by Americans, represented engineering achievements beyond Japanese capability. Every flush toilet, every electric switch, every hot water tap testified to American systematic competence. As Germany surrendered in May 1945, Japanese prisoners observed the treatment of German POWs preparing for repatriation. The Germans received the same considerate treatment, the same supplies for their journey home, the same preparation for returning to defeated nations. This consistent humane treatment, regardless of enemy nationality, demonstrated American adherence to principles rather than emotional responses. The systematic processing of hundreds of thousands of prisoners with efficiency and dignity showed organizational capability matching industrial might. News of Japan's surrender reached Camp McCoy through official announcement, and prisoner reactions ranged from relief to despair. Relief that the killing would end, despair at the shame of survival when so many had died, but also, for many, recognition that defeat might open possibilities for a different kind of Japan. The lessons learned in American captivity about democracy, productivity, and human dignity might help rebuild a nation freed from militarism. The final months in camp before repatriation became periods of intensive preparation. Prisoners who'd learned English taught others basic phrases. Those who'd learned American agricultural or industrial techniques shared knowledge. Former military ranks became irrelevant as practical skills gained in prison became more valuable. The transformation from military hierarchy to civilian cooperation began in the camps before returning to Japan. American authorities' efforts to document prisoner experiences for historical records, though limited by language barriers and prisoner reluctance, demonstrated another aspect of American society: the importance of preserving history, even uncomfortable history. Prisoners were interviewed, photographs taken, records maintained. This historical consciousness, the idea that enemy prisoner experiences were worth recording, reflected a confidence in historical judgment that contrasted with Japan's tendency to hide shameful events. When Kazuo Sakamaki and other Japanese POWs finally returned to Japan, they found a nation destroyed beyond their worst fears, yet beginning reconstruction under American occupation. The skills they'd learned in prison, English language, American agricultural and industrial methods, understanding of democracy, suddenly became valuable rather than shameful. Many found employment with occupation forces or in rebuilding industries specifically because of knowledge gained in captivity. The contrast between their camp experience and Japan's condition reinforced lessons about American capacity. They'd lived comfortably as prisoners while Japan starved. They'd received medical care while Japanese civilians died from treatable diseases. They'd eaten meat daily while Japanese civilians survived on sweet potato vines. This contrast completed the psychological transformation begun with their first American meal, understanding that different ways of organizing society produced vastly different results. Some former POWs became quiet advocates for change in post-war Japan. Without discussing their prisoner experiences directly, they promoted ideas learned in camps: efficiency over tradition, pragmatism over ideology, productivity over sacrifice. They applied American farming methods to increase food production. They used American organizational techniques to improve factory efficiency. They taught English to help Japan engage with the international community. Each contribution, though never acknowledged as deriving from prison experience, helped transform Japan from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy. The children and grandchildren of Japanese POWs grew up in a Japan profoundly different from the one their fathers had fought to preserve. When former prisoners occasionally spoke about their wartime experiences in later years, younger generations struggled to understand the shame and transformation their elders had experienced. The abundance that had shocked prisoners in 1943 became normal in Japan by the 1970s. The democracy that had seemed impossible became Japan's governing system. The friendship with America that had been inconceivable became the cornerstone of Japanese foreign policy. Kazuo Sakamaki lived until 1999, spending his final years in Toyota City, having helped build one of Japan's most successful international corporations. His journey from submarine commander to prisoner number 1 to international business executive embodied the transformation of Japan itself. In 1991, when he visited the National Museum of the Pacific War in Texas and saw his submarine for the first time in 50 years, he reportedly wept not from shame, but from contemplation of the journey that had begun with his capture on that December morning in 1941. The story of Japanese POWs in American camps remains largely untold in Japan, where cultural sensitivity about surrender continues. Yet the impact of their experience rippled through post-war Japanese society in countless ways. The 5,000 Japanese soldiers who experienced American abundance as prisoners became unconscious agents of change, carrying knowledge that contradicted everything militaristic Japan had taught them. Their transformation began not with political indoctrination or forced re-education, but with simple daily acts of eating American food that demonstrated through the most basic human experience that entirely different ways of living were possible. The meals served in American POW camps, from basic breakfast rations to elaborate Christmas dinners, accomplished what military defeat alone could not. They proved through direct visceral experience that American strength came not from racial superiority or divine favor, but from systematic organization of society to produce abundance. Every egg, every slice of bread, every cup of real coffee served to Japanese prisoners carried a message more powerful than any propaganda: that societies organized around human dignity and democratic principles could generate wealth and power exceeding anything authoritarianism could achieve. The Japanese POWs, who sat down to their first American meal expecting torture and starvation, discovered instead a society so confident in its strength that it could afford to treat enemies with dignity. This discovery, repeated 3 times daily for years of captivity, transformed their understanding of strength, power, and human possibility. They'd arrived in America as warriors prepared to die for a divine emperor, and left as men who'd learned that true strength came not from willingness to die, but from ability to create life, prosperity, and even kindness toward enemies. The transformation was complete, permanent, and largely unspoken. The Japanese soldiers, stunned by their first American meal, returned to Japan carrying knowledge that would help transform their nation from militaristic empire to peaceful democracy. They'd tasted freedom in American mess halls, digested democracy with every meal, and consumed lessons about human dignity that no amount of shame could erase. In the end, the first American meal served to Japanese POWs had indeed changed them forever, transforming enemies into future partners in building a more peaceful world.